Chapter 5 of the Theory of Social Revolutions. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Theory of Social Revolutions by Brooks Adams. Chapter 5 Political Courts. In the eye of philosophy, perhaps the most alluring and yet elusive of all the phenomena presented by civilization is that which we have been considering. Why should a type of mind which has developed the highest prescience when advancing along the curve which has led it to ascendancy be stricken with fatuity when the summit of the curve is passed, and when a miscalculation touching the velocity of the descent must be destruction? Although this phenomenon has appeared pretty regularly at certain intervals in the development of every modern nation, I conceive its most illuminating example to be that intellectual limitation of caste which, during the French Revolution, led to the creation of those political criminal tribunals which reached perfection with Robespierre. When coolly examined at the distance of a century, the Royalist combination for the suppression of equality before the law, as finally evolved in 1792, did not so much lack military intelligence as it lacked any approximate comprehension of the modern mind. The Royalists proposed to re-establish privilege, and to do this they were ready to immolate if necessary their king and queen, and all of their own order, who stayed at home to defend them. Indeed, speaking generally, they valued Louis XV living, cheaply enough, counting him a more considerable asset if dead. What a noise it would make throughout Europe, they whispered among themselves, if the rabble should kill the king. Nor did Marie Antoinette delude herself on this score. At Pilnitz in 1791 the German potentates issued a declaration touching France which was too moderate to suit the emigrants, who published upon it a commentary of their own. This commentary was so revolting that when the Queen read her brother-in-law's signature appended to it, she exclaimed "Cain." The Royalist plan of campaign was this. They reckoned the energy of their revolution so low that they counted pretty confidently, in the summer of 1792, on the ability of their party to defend the Tuileries against any force which could be brought against it, but assuming that the Tuileries could not be defended and that the King and Queen should be massacred, they believed that their own position would be improved. Their monarchical allies would be thereby violently stimulated. It was determined, therefore, that regardless of consequences to their friends, the invading army should cross the border into Lorraine, and marching by way of Sercq and Rodemack, occupy Châlons. Their entry into Châlons, which they were confident could not be held against them, because of the feeling throughout the country, was to be the signal for the rising in Vendée and Brittany, which should sweep down upon Paris from the rear and make the capital untenable. At Châlons the Allies would be but 90 miles from Paris, and then nothing would remain but vengeance. And vengeance the more complete, the greater the crime had been. All went well with them up to Valmy. The German advance on August 11, 1792, reached Rodemack, and on August 19 the bulk of the Prussian army crossed the frontier at Redignay. On August 20, 1792, Longwy was invested and in 3 days capitulated. In the camp of the Comte d'Artois there was not one of us, wrote Las Casas, who did not see himself, in a fortnight, triumphant in his own home, surrounded by his humbled and submissive vassals. At length from their bivouacs at Saint Remy and at Soupey, the nobles saw in the distance the towns of Châlons. The panic at Châlons was so great that orders were given to cut the bridge across the Marne, but it was not until about September 2 that the whole peril was understood at Paris. It is true that for several weeks the government had been aware that the West was agitated and that Rouërie was probably conspiring among the Royalists and non-juring priests, but they did not appreciate the imminence of the danger. On September 3 at latest, Danton certainly heard the details of the plot from a spy, and it was then, while others quailed, that he incited Paris to audacity. This was Danton's culmination. As we look back, The weakness of the Germans seems to have been psychological rather than physical. At Valmy the numbers engaged were not unequal, and while the French were, for the most part, raw and ill compacted levies with few trained officers, the German regiments were those renowned battalions of Frederick the Great, whose onset during the 7 Years' War no adversary had been able to endure. Yet these redoubtable Prussians fell back in confusion without having seriously tried the French position, and their officers apparently did not venture to call upon them to charge again. In vain the French gentlemen implored the Prussian king to support them if they alone should storm Kellermann's batteries. Under the advice of the Duke of Brunswick, the king decided on retreat. It is said that the Duke had as little heart in the war as Charles Fox, or possibly Pitt, or as his own troops. And yet he was so strong that Dumouriez, after his victory, hung back and offered the invaders free passage, lest the Germans, if aroused, should turn on him and fight their way to the Marne. To the emigrants the retreat was terrible. It was a disaster from which as a compact power they never recovered. The rising in Vendée temporarily collapsed with the check at Châlons, and they were left literally naked unto their enemy. Some of them returned to their homes, preferring the guillotine to starvation. Others, disguised in peasants' blouses, tried to reach Rouergue in La Vendée. Some died from hardship, some committed suicide, while the bulk regained Liège, and there waited as suppliants for assistance from Vienna. But these unfortunate men who had entered so gaily upon a conflict whose significance they could not comprehend, had by this time lost more than lands and castles. Many of them had lost wives and children in one of the most frightful butcheries of history, and a butchery for which they themselves were responsible, because it was the inevitable and logical effect of their own intellectual limitations. When, after the affair of August 10, Danton and his party became masters of the incipient republic, Paris lay between two perils whose relative magnitude no one could measure. If Châlons fell, Vendée would rise, and the republicans of the West would be massacred. 5 months later Vendée did rise, and at Machecoul the patriots were slaughtered amidst nameless atrocities, largely at the instigation of the priests. In March 1793 100,000 peasants were under arms. Clearly the West could not be denuded of troops, and yet if Châlons were to be made good, every available man had to be hurried to Kellermann, and this gigantic effort fell to the lot of a body of young and inexperienced adventurers, who formed what could hardly be dignified with the name of an organized administration. For a long time Marat, with whom Danton had been obliged to coalesce, had been insisting that, if the enemy were to be resisted on the frontier, Paris must first be purged, for Paris swarmed with royalists wild for revenge, and who were known to be arming. Danton was not yet prepared for extermination. He instituted domiciliary visits. He made about 3,000 arrests and seized a quantity of muskets, but he liberated most of those who were under suspicion. The crisis only came with the news, on September 2, of the investment of Verdun, when no one longer could doubt that the net was closing about Paris. Verdun was but 3 or 4 days' march from Châlons. When the Duke of Brunswick crossed the Marne and Brittany revolted, the government would have to flee, as Roland proposed, and then the royalists would burst the gates of the prisons, and there would be another Saint Bartholomew. Toward 4 o'clock in the afternoon of September 2, 1792, the prison of the Abbaye was forced and the massacres began. They lasted until September 6, and through a circular sent out by Marat, they were extended to Lyons, to Reims, and to the other cities. About 1,600 prisoners were murdered in Paris alone. Hardly any one has ever defended those slaughters. Even Marat called them disastrous, and yet no one interfered. Neither Danton, nor Roland, nor the Assembly, nor the National Guard, nor the City of Paris, although the 200 or 300 ruffians who did the work could have been dispersed by a single company of resolute men, had society so willed it. When Robespierre's time came he fell almost automatically. Though the head of the despotic Committee of Public Safety, and nominally the most